The M4 Sherman tank was the backbone of the United States and Western Allies during World War II. Officially called the medium tank M4, it was known for its reliability and cost-effectiveness, leading to its widespread use on the battlefield. Produced in large numbers, the Sherman was a crucial asset in various roles, including self-propelled artillery and tank destroyers. Through the Lend-Lease program, tens of thousands were supplied to the British Commonwealth and the Soviet Union. The British named it after Civil War General William Tecumseh Sherman. Design and development. The M4 Sherman evolved from the M3 medium tank, which had a side-mounted gun for quick development. The M4 kept much of the M3's design but featured a central turret with a 75mm gun. It even had a gyrostabilizer to help aim the gun while on the move, though it wasn't precise enough for firing accurately without stopping. Designers focused on making it reliable, easy to produce and maintain, and compatible with existing equipment. These priorities made the Sherman superior to German tanks from 1939 to 1942. The M4 became America's most produced tank, with 49,324 units made. It played a key role in many Allied offensives from 1942 onward. Combat history. In late 1942, the M4 Sherman first saw combat with the British at the Second Battle of El Alamein in North Africa. It gave the Allies a significant edge over Axis armor, outperforming lighter German and Italian tanks. The U.S. Army believed the M4 was enough to win the war and didn't push for more advanced tanks initially. Logistical challenges also made deploying heavier tanks difficult. M4-based tank destroyers with better guns were also widely used. Despite being outgunned by newer German tanks by 1944, the M4's reliability, logistical support, and numerical superiority helped it stay effective. Later models had improved guns, like the 76mm M1, and the British upgraded some with a powerful 17-pounder gun, known as the Sherman Firefly. Others got a 105mm gun for infantry support. The Sherman's ease of production and efficient repair units meant damaged tanks were quickly fixed and back in action. This gave the Allies a numbers advantage in most battles. By 1944, many U.S. infantry divisions had M4 Shermans and tank destroyers for support. Even after World War II, the M4 Sherman continued to serve in various conflicts. It saw action with UN forces in Korea, with Israel in the Arab-Israeli Wars, in South Vietnam during the Vietnam War, and in the Indo-Pakistani War of 1965. U.S. design prototype. The M4 Sherman tank, designed by the United States Army Ordnance Department, replaced the M3 medium tank, which itself was an upgrade of the M2 medium tank from 1939, originally derived from the 1935 M2 light tank. The M3 was a temporary solution until a new turret for a 75mm gun could be developed. While effective against German forces in Africa, the M3's high profile due to the 37mm gun turret on top, and the limited traverse of its main side-mounted gun, posed issues. Despite initial reluctance to adopt British designs, American engineers integrated successful British ideas, influenced by the Canadian General Staff, into the Sherman. The M4 Sherman incorporated lessons from earlier American light tanks, including vertical volute spring suspension, rubber bush tracks, and a rear-mounted radial engine with front drive sprockets. The goal was a fast, reliable medium tank capable of supporting infantry, breaking through enemy lines, and defeating Axis tanks. The T6 prototype, completed on September 2, 1941, featured a single large casting for the upper hull, a single overhead hatch for the driver, and a side hatch. In the M4A1 production model, the side hatch was removed, and a second overhead hatch was added. This design, known as the T6, was finalized as the M4 in February 1942, with cast hull models later reclassified as M4A1 and welded hull models as M4. In August 1942, the Detroit Arsenal proposed an angled hull and turret armor for improved protection without increasing weight. As the U.S. prepared for World War II, armored tactics were outlined in Field Manual 100-5, Operations, May 1941, which emphasized mobility and firepower for decisive missions. The Sherman wasn't just an infantry support tank, it was part of the Armored Division's striking force, with infantry in a support role. Tank versus tank combat was just one of its roles, with early manuals dedicating little space to it. The Doctrine, influenced by German Blitzkrieg successes, expected tank destroyer battalions with towed and self-propelled anti-tank guns to handle massed enemy tank attacks, with tanks providing support. In practice, this doctrine proved impractical, as commanders often needed immediate anti-tank capabilities at the front lines, making it difficult to keep tank destroyers in reserve. This led to American tank battalions facing breakthroughs without all their anti-tank assets in place at the start of an attack. U.S. production history. The first Sherman tanks rolled off the production line at the Lima Locomotive Works, with many early units destined for British use under the Lend-Lease program. The very first Sherman was evaluated by the U.S. Army, while the second was sent to London, earning the nickname Michael, likely after Michael Dewar, the head of the British tank mission in the US. This tank is now displayed at the Tank Museum in Bovington, UK. During World War II, the U.S. Army fielded 16 armored divisions and 70 separate tank battalions, while the Marine Corps had 6 tank battalions. A third of the Army tank battalions and all Marine tank battalions were deployed to the Pacific Theater. Before September 1942, President Franklin D. Roosevelt announced a production plan for 120,000 tanks to support the Allies. Despite no bombing or submarine threats affecting American industry, steel was heavily diverted to naval construction, leading to the production of about 53,500 tanks in 1942 and 1943. The M4 Sherman had several main variants: M4, M4A1, M4A2, M4A3, M4A4, and M4A6. These variants mainly differed in engine types, with the M4A1 featuring a fully cast upper hull with a distinctive rounded shape. The M4A4 had a longer hull to accommodate its longer engine, requiring more track blocks and wider spacing between the bogies. The M4A6, with its radial diesel engine, saw limited production with only 75 units made. Most Shermans ran on gasoline engines. The M4 and M4A1 used a 9-cylinder radial gasoline engine producing up to 400 horsepower. The M4A3 featured a 450 horsepower liquid-cooled V8 gasoline engine, while the M4A4 used a 370 horsepower 30-cylinder multibank gasoline engine. Diesel variants included the M4A2, powered by twin inline engines producing 375 horsepower, and the M4A6, with a 450 horsepower radial diesel engine. The term M4 could refer specifically to the initial model with the Continental radial engine or generally to the entire family of Sherman tanks. British nomenclature used mark numbers for hull types and letters for differences in armament and suspension, such as Shermania for a British-operated M4A1 with a 76mm gun. Early Shermans mounted a 75mm medium-velocity gun. Although work began on replacements, the Army continued with the M4 to avoid production disruption. Later models received a larger turret with a 76mm high-velocity gun. The first 76mm armed Sherman, an M4A1, saw combat in July 1944 during Operation Cobra. The M4 and M4A3 also featured a 105mm howitzer variant for additional firepower. From May to July 1944, the Army accepted 254 M4A3E2 jumbo Shermans, featuring thick hull armor and a 75mm gun, with some units later equipped with a 76mm cannon. The M4A3 model introduced the HVSS system with wider tracks, earning the nickname Easy 8 for its smooth ride. Various special attachments were developed, such as bulldozer blades, flamethrowers, and rocket launchers, although few saw combat. The M4 Sherman's chassis was versatile, supporting roles like tank destroyers, self-propelled artillery, recovery tanks, and artillery prime movers. Production was widespread, with numerous manufacturers contributing to the 49,234 total units produced. Service history. Allocation and distribution of Sherman tanks during World War II. The U.S. Army received around 19,247 Sherman tanks, while the U.S. Marine Corps got about 1,114. The U.S. also sent 17,184 Shermans to the United Kingdom, some of which went to Canadian and Free Polish forces. The Soviet Union received 4,102 Shermans, and about 812 were sent to China. These tanks were further distributed among Allied nations. In the Pacific, the U.S. Marine Corps used both the diesel-powered M4A2 and gasoline-powered M4A3. However, Lieutenant General Jacob L. Devers, the chief of the Army's armored force, ordered that no diesel Shermans be used outside the continental U.S. The Army used all types for training and testing but primarily exported the M4A2 and M4A4 under Lend-Lease. First combat. The Sherman tank saw its first combat during the Western Desert Campaign. After the Axis captured Tobruk in June 1942, threatening Egypt, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill urgently requested Sherman tanks from President Franklin D. Roosevelt. Over 300 Shermans, mostly M4A1s, but including some M4A2s, were sent to the Middle East by September 1942. These tanks, modified for desert warfare, first saw action in the Second Battle of El Alamein in October 1942. The first U.S. Shermans, M4S, and M4A1s, fought in Operation Torch in November 1942. In North Africa, M4S and M4A1S gradually replaced the older Mies. By late 1944, the preferred M4A3 with a 500 horsepower engine began replacing earlier models. The M4A1 was the first Sherman to combat with a 76mm gun in July 1944, followed by the M4A2 and M4A3. By the end of the war, about half of the U.S. Army Shermans in Europe had the 76mm gun. The first HVSS-equipped Sherman, the M4A376W, saw combat in December 1944. Eastern Front under Lend-Lease, the Soviet Union received 4,102 M4A2 Shermans, with about half equipped with the 76mm gun. These tanks arrived in the Soviet Union by late summer 1944. The Red Army valued the M4A2 for its reliability and ease of maintenance but noted its higher center of gravity made it prone to overturning. By 1945, some Soviet armored units were entirely equipped with Shermans. Soviet crews appreciated the Sherman for its good firepower and auxiliary power unit, APU, but criticized its high profile and narrow tracks, which struggled in muddy conditions compared to the T-34 or German Panther. Pacific Theater. In the Pacific Theater, the U.S. Marine Corps initially used M2A4 light tanks against Japanese Type 95 AGO light tanks during the Guadalcanal campaign. By 1943, U.S. forces replaced their light tanks with M4 Shermans, while the Japanese continued using older models. The Shermans proved effective in jungle warfare, where lighter tanks were easier to deploy. The Japanese developed the Type 3 Kai-Nu and Type 4 Cheetah tanks with 75mm guns to counter the Shermans, but these models saw limited production and no combat. The U.S. relied on high explosive rounds and flamethrower-equipped Shermans to fight Japanese tanks and fortifications. Korean War. During the Korean War, the M4A3E8 EZ-8 was the main U.S. tank until the armistice. Initially, there were few tanks available for rapid deployment due to post-World War II disarmament. The U.S. Far East Command collected 58 M4A3E8 tanks in Japan and formed the 8072nd Temporary Tank Battalion, which landed in Pusan in August 1950. The M4A3E8 proved effective against North Korean T-34-85 tanks, with superior optics, crew training, and VAP ammunition. Although the M4A3E8 had weaker anti-tank capabilities than the M26 Pershing and M46 Patton, it was preferred for its maneuverability and reliability. The M4A3E8 was widely used for infantry support, especially in battles for high ground. By December 1951, around 20 M4A3E8s served with the Republic of Korea Marine Corps, while the Army used M36 GMCs as its main armored asset. Other uses. After World War II, the U.S. continued using the M4A3E8 EZ-8, eventually replacing it with the M47, M48, and M60 Patton tanks. The U.S. transferred Shermans to allies, leading to widespread use globally. The Israeli Defense Force used Shermans from its inception in 1948 until the 1980s. Initially acquiring a single M4A2 from British forces, Israel later purchased 30 unarmed M4 105mm from Italian scrapyards. These tanks, armed with 75mm guns, saw extensive service during the 1948-9 War of Independence. The Shermans were gradually replaced by M4A1, 76mm, Shermans from France. Before the 1967 Six-Day War, Israel upgraded about 180 Shermans with French 105mm guns and Cummins diesel engines, designating them Sherman M51. These tanks performed well against Egyptian and Syrian forces. British forces used M4A3s in Indonesia until 1946, passing them to the Nile and later to the Indonesian National Armed Forces. Armament Development. When the Sherman tank was being designed, it was intended to accommodate various types of main armament, including a 75mm gun, a 3-inch gun, and a 105mm howitzer. Initially, there was an attempt to fit the 3-inch gun M7, which was derived from an anti-aircraft gun, into the Sherman's turret. However, its size and weight made it unsuitable. This led to the development of a new 76mm gun specifically for the Sherman, beginning in late 1942. In early 1942, tests started to see if a 105mm howitzer could be mounted on the Sherman. The original 105mm howitzer M2A1 was redesigned into the 105mm howitzer M4 to fit in the tank turret. After making necessary adjustments to balance the gun and strengthen the turret, the Ordnance Department approved the design, and production of 105mm armed Shermans began in February 1944. The Sherman entered combat in 1942 equipped with the 75mm gun M3, capable of penetrating 88mm of armor at 100 yards and 73mm at 1,000 yards using the M61 APC round. This gun was effective against the early German Panzer III and IV tanks in North Africa. However, U.S. Army intelligence underestimated the threat posed by the Tiger I and Panther tanks, believing the 76mm gun could handle them. Later, it was found that tests against American armor plates were not representative of actual combat conditions. Consequently, the 76mm gun was not as effective as initially thought. The 76mm gun, named T1, was first installed in the Sherman in early 1943. It caused balance issues in the turret, and the barrel's length made it impractical. The gun was shortened, resulting in the M1 variant, and mounted on a turret designed for the cancelled T-23 tank project. This combination became the definitive 76mm armed Sherman. Despite developing new 76mm and 90mm anti-tank guns, the Army ground forces initially rejected them. An attempt to install a 90mm turret from the T-26 tank on a Sherman hull was abandoned in April 1944, as it would delay the T-26's production. The disparity in firepower between German tanks and the 75mm armed Shermans prompted the production of 76mm armed Shermans in January 1944. The 76mm gun's muzzle blast was problematic, but the addition of a muzzle brake in the M1A2 variant in October 1944 resolved this. U.S. Army Doctrine emphasized the tank's multi-role capability, valuing the 75mm gun's high explosive shell for infantry support. Initially, all Shermans deployed in Normandy in June 1944 had the 75mm gun. The need for better anti-tank firepower became evident, leading to the deployment of 76mm Shermans in July 1944 during Operation Cobra. The 76mm gun improved the Sherman's anti-tank capabilities against German vehicles like the Panzer IV and Stuke III but was less effective against the Panther and Tiger tanks. The 76mm gun could penetrate 125mm of armor at 100 yards and 106mm at 1,000 yards using the M62 round. The 76mm gun's performance was comparable to the Panzer IV's 75mm gun but inferior to the Panther's 75mm length/70 gun. High-velocity armor-piercing (HVAP) ammunition, available from September 1944, increased the 76mm gun's penetration, allowing it to match the Panther's APCR rounds. However, tungsten shortages limited VAP availability, and most Shermans carried few rounds. The British developed the 17-pounder gun for their Sherman Firefly variant, which could penetrate 174mm of armor at 100 yards and 150mm at 1,000 yards. Despite the 17-pounder's greater firepower, the U.S. Army opted to produce the 76mm armed M4 and 90mm armed M36 tank destroyer. After the Battle of the Bulge, General Eisenhower requested only 76mm armed Shermans for Europe. Interest in mounting the 17-pounder on U.S. Shermans resurfaced, leading to about 100 conversions, but these were not deployed in combat by the U.S. tank destroyer doctrine. General Leslie J. McNair, head of the Army Ground Forces, advocated using tank destroyers, TDs, to countermast enemy tanks, while tanks were to support infantry and exploit breakthroughs. TDs, which included lightly armored vehicles with powerful anti-tank guns, were meant to be faster than tanks. McNair approved the 76mm upgrade for the Sherman and the 90mm armed M36 tank destroyer but opposed the T-26 medium tank series during 1943. Lieutenant General Devers requested 250 T-26 tanks for the invasion of France, but McNair initially refused, believing the M4 was adequate. Eventually, the War Department ordered the tanks built. Despite urgent requests for heavy tanks after the Normandy invasion, production was delayed due to mechanical issues. The T-26, later designated M26 Pershing, saw limited combat starting in February 1945. Variants and secondary armament. The Sherman tank featured various armament configurations, including a coaxial .30 caliber M1919 Browning machine gun, a hull-mounted M1919, and a pinel-mounted .50 caliber M2 Browning for anti-aircraft defense. Early models also had fixed forward-firing M1919 machine guns operated by the driver, inherited from earlier tank designs. The Sherman's 75mm gun had effective canister and white phosphorus rounds, used for clearing obstacles and blinding enemy tanks. The 105mm howitzer-armed Shermans provided close fire support and smoke, although their low muzzle velocity made hitting enemy armor difficult. Armor. The Sherman tank's turret armor ranged from 1 inch to 3 inches thick. The front turret armor was 3 inches thick, angled at 30 degrees, making it effectively about 3.5 inches thick. The main gun opening was shielded by a rounded 2-inch thick rotor. Early models had a smaller 3-inch thick mantlet covering only the gun barrel opening, making the coaxial machine gun vulnerable to debris. Later versions added a larger 3-inch thick mantlet, covering the rotor shield and the coaxial machine gun. The 105mm armed Shermans had only a mantlet. The turret sides and rear were 2 inches thick, while the roof was 1 inch thick and flat. Later Sherman models like the M4A1, M4A2, and M4A3 featured the T-80 turret from the T-23 tank and a new 76mm gun. This turret had 2.5-inch thick armor on the sides and rear, angled from 0 to 13 degrees, and a 1-inch thick roof angled from 0 to 45 degrees. The T-23 turret's front, like the 105mm armed Sherman's turret, had no rotor shield but was protected by an unsloped 3.5-inch thick cast gun mantlet. Combat experience showed the need for better evacuation routes, leading to the addition of a loader's hatch beside the commanders in late 1943. All 76mm gun turrets had 2 roof hatches. Initially, the Sherman's glassy plate was 2 inches thick and angled at 56 degrees, providing an effective thickness of 3.6 inches. Early models had protruding hatchway structures for the driver and assistant driver, reducing the effectiveness of the glassy plate's slope. Later models had a uniformly 2.5-inch thick glassy plate sloped at 47 degrees, improving overall ballistic protection. The transmission housing was rounded, made of 3 cast sections bolted together or cast as one piece, ranging from 2 to 4.25 inches thick. The upper and lower hull sides and the upper hull rear were 1.5 inches thick, while the lower hull rear was also 1.5 inches thick but sloped depending on the variant. The hull roof was 1 inch thick, and the hull floor ranged from 1 inch thick under the driver and assistant driver to 0.5 inches thick at the rear. The Sherman had a hatch on the hull bottom for disposing of spent shell casings and emergency escape, which Marines used in reverse to recover wounded infantry under fire in the Pacific. The Sherman's armor was initially inadequate against most Axis tanks and anti-tank weapons. Early Sherman's protruding hatchways compromised the glassy plate's effectiveness. In 1943, 1-inch thick applique armor plates were fitted to the sponson sides over the ammunition stowage bins to address this issue. German reports estimated that the Tiger I's 8.8 cm gun could penetrate the Sherman's turret front from 1,800 meters but not the upper glacis at any range. The Panther's 7.5 cm gun could penetrate the Sherman's glacis at close range. British research showed that Shermans often caught fire when penetrated, primarily due to ammunition stowage in vulnerable sponsons. Later models with wet stowage reduced the chance of fire to about 15%. Various upgrades and field improvisations were made to improve the Sherman's armor. These included rectangular armor patches over ammunition stowage and smaller patches in front of the hatchway structures. Field modifications included sandbags, spare track links, concrete, and wire mesh for additional protection against shaped charge rounds. The M4A3E2 Jumbo Assault Tank variant had extra armor welded on, making the glacis 5.9 inches thick, with over 7.1 inches effective thickness. The sponson sides were 3 inches thick, and the transmission cover was significantly thicker. A new T-23 style turret with 7 inches of armor on the sides and rear was added, with a 1-inch thick roof. The gun mantlet had an additional 3.5 inches of armor welded on. The Jumbo was originally armed with the 75mm gun, although some were later upgraded to the 76mm. These tanks were used in various roles and were highly successful. Mobility. In the early stages of designing a replacement for the M3 medium tank, the U.S. Army set strict limitations on the Sherman's dimensions and weight. These restrictions were essential to ensure the tank could be transported easily across bridges, roads, railroads, and landing craft without requiring special modifications. Specifically, Army Regulation 850-15 limited the tank's width to 103 inches and its weight to 30 tons. These specifications greatly enhanced the Sherman's strategic, logistical, and tactical flexibility, benefiting all Allied armored forces that used it. A service trial in Britain in 1943 compared diesel and gasoline Shermans with Cromwell and Centre tanks. The British officer in charge concluded that while the Sherman might not perform as smoothly as the Cromwell on worn rubber tracks and greasy terrain, its superior reliability and minimal maintenance needs outweighed these issues. The Sherman demonstrated good speed on both roads and off-road. Its performance off-road varied. In the desert, the Sherman's rubber block tracks were effective, and in Italy's hilly terrain, the Sherman often navigated areas that heavier German tanks could not. Albert Speer, in his autobiography Inside the Third Reich, noted the Sherman's impressive cross-country mobility in Italy, highlighting its powerful engine relative to its weight. However, this advantage diminished when comparing the Sherman to the second-generation German tanks like the Panther and Tiger. German tests at Kummersdorf and U.S. tests by the 2nd Armored Division showed that the Panther and Tiger outperformed the Sherman in maneuverability and ground pressure. The Sherman's initial tracks were 16.5 inches wide, resulting in a ground pressure of 14 pounds per square inch. On soft ground, this narrower track width led to poorer performance compared to the wider tracks of the Panther and Tiger, which had better flotation due to their lower ground pressure and interleaved road wheels. Lieutenant Colonel Wilson M. Hawkins of the 2nd Armored Division reported that the Panther was faster and more maneuverable than the Sherman, both off-road and on highways. Technical Sergeant Willard D. May also found the Panther to be at least as maneuverable as the Sherman, with better flotation. Staff Sergeant Charles A. Carden added that the Panther and Tiger tanks had superior maneuverability and flotation, capable of operating over terrain where the Sherman would bog down. As a temporary solution to the Sherman's track width problem, the U.S. Army introduced extended end connectors, known as duckbills, to widen the standard tracks. These duckbills were first used in frontline tank battalions in late 1944 and were standard on the heavy M4A3E2 jumbo to support its extra armor weight. Later models like the M4A376WHVSS Shermans featured wider track suspensions, addressing these issues, but these models were relatively few in number even by 1945. Reliability. M4A1 In September 1942, the British conducted tests and suggested improvements for the M4A1 Sherman. After 500 miles of testing, issues arose such as broken springs on the left front bogie, oil accumulation in the engine compartment, and engine stalling due to fuel supply interruptions. The engine, found to be improperly built and installed, showed significant wear after just 65 hours of operation. Despite these setbacks, the engine was reinstalled, and adjustments were made to the fuel system to improve performance. In November 1943, several M4A1 Shermans underwent testing at an American proving ground to evaluate British innovations. One tank incorporated 37 experimental changes, another had 47, and a third had 53. Overall, 60 modifications were developed and tested, most proving successful after a 600-mile run and firing tests. M4A2 in Africa, British forces found that Sherman engines typically lasted 700 to 900 miles, requiring inspection and repair after 100 hours to extend service life. However, crews often skipped this maintenance due to time constraints. The Sherman's engine had reliability issues, including broken wiring and clutch rods. Despite these problems, the M4A2 performed well in hot climates and was favored in the Mediterranean theater. By June 1943, the average service life was estimated at 1,500 miles. The Soviet 6th Guards Tank Army reported a lifespan of 1,200 to 1,600 miles for their M4A2 Shermans, comparable to the T-34. M4A3 The Ford V8-engined M4A3S participated in a 1943 survival race, averaging 255 hours of engine operation. Despite some engines failing early, most could be returned to service with minor repairs. The M4A3 covered greater distances than other Shermans, with 10 vehicles collectively covering 20,346 miles over 2,388 hours. Further testing in 1944 showed impressive reliability, with one tank covering 2,097 miles in 203 hours. A smaller reliability test of 20 Shermans, including 4 M4A3s, measured repair times. The M4A3 required 110 hours for engine maintenance, outperforming the M4A1 and M4A2 but falling short of the Chrysler Multibank engine's 45-hour maintenance time. In transmission time, the M4A3 was superior, needing 112 hours compared to the M4A4's 340 hours. Although none of the Ford engine tanks completed the entire test route, the M4A3 was considered highly reliable. M4A4 In October 1942, tests in the California desert revealed cooling system issues with the M4A4. By spring 1943, improvements recommended by the Armored Council were implemented, and 10 M4A4s successfully completed a 4,000-mile range test, with an average engine service life of 240 hours. Additional tests from October 1943 to February 1944 showed even better results, with 3 out of 4 tanks completing 400 hours of operation with minimal power loss. Despite positive test outcomes, high oil and fuel consumption led to the discontinuation of M4A4 production on October 10, 1943. The M4A4 was declared obsolete in 1945. Engine. Diesel M4A2 superiority. The diesel M4A2 Shermans were notably superior to their gasoline engine counterparts. The M4A3 tank, equipped with a Ford GAA V8 gasoline engine, was first assembled in May 1942 and outperformed the R975 engine in all respects. Even the M4A4 featured a more reliable engine compared to the R975. Continental R975. The R975 engine quickly became outdated once the Sherman entered service. Initially powered by high-octane aviation gasoline, it had to be adapted to lower-grade fuel due to wartime constraints. In April 1942, an engine with a compression ratio of 5.7 was tested and deemed acceptable. This new engine ran at higher RPMs, used a richer fuel mixture, and had a larger combustion chamber. Large-scale engine tests in the winter of 1943 to 1944. Extensive tests were conducted at the Aberdeen Proving Grounds involving 4 examples each of the M4A1, M4A2, M4A3, and M4A4. The goal was to reach 4,000 miles or 400 hours of runtime. Any faults, except motor issues, were repaired to continue testing. Engines were removed from the competition if they suffered critical damage or lost a third of their original power. During these tests, the R975 and the M4A1 required 132 hours of servicing. The GM diesel M4A2 took 143 hours, the Ford GAA M4A3 needed 110 hours, and the multibank M4A4 only took 45 hours. None of the R975 engines reached the 200-hour mark, failing on average after 166 hours. A significant amount of time, over 446 man-hours, was spent on servicing the air filters for the R975 during 23 days of testing. Improved R975C4 engine efforts to improve the R975 resulted in the R975C4, which increased power from 432 to 493 horsepower and reduced fuel consumption by 10%. The engine torque also improved. Older engines were upgraded to this model during major overhauls. GM 6046 engine approved for production on June 17, 1943. The GM 6046 engine was initially ordered for the gun motor carriage T-70 tank destroyer and later demanded by the British for their Shermans. Tests in February 1944 showed increased power, reduced oil consumption by 35%, and a 50 degrees Celsius drop in cylinder temperature. The M4A1 with the new engine demonstrated faster speeds and increased reliability. 1943 large-scale trials. In 1943, 40 Shermans underwent trials, aiming for 400 hours or 4,000 miles before engine failure. The M4A2 had the lowest fuel consumption among Shermans and covered 22,126 miles, running for 2,424 hours. The M4A2 was the fastest, averaging 9.5 miles per hour, while the M4A1 and M4A4 both made 8 miles per hour, and the M4A3 made 9.25 miles per hour. Chrysler A57 engine. In terms of reliability, the M4A2 ranked third, with engines averaging 225 hours before breakdowns. The R975 engines performed worse, averaging 218 hours. The Ford GAA and Chrysler A57 were more reliable, averaging 255 and 240 hours, respectively. Survival race. In late 1943, 20 vehicles, including 4 M4A1, M4A2, M4A3, M4A4, and new M4E1 tanks with experimental engines, participated in a survival race on various terrains. By December 27, all M4A1s and 1 M4A3 failed, but no diesel engine tanks did. The M4A2s performed well, with 3 failing after 276, 278, and 353 hours, respectively, and 1 covering 4,295 miles in 403 hours. By March 18, the M4A4 proved the most reliable, with 3 out of 4 tanks completing the test. Maintenance and reliability. The M4A2 required more maintenance than the M4A3 and M4A1, taking 143 hours compared to 110 and 132 hours, respectively. However, the M4A2 excelled in fuel efficiency and overall reliability, making it a valuable asset in the field. These tests and improvements highlight the ongoing efforts to enhance the reliability and performance of the Sherman tanks, ensuring they remained a formidable force on the battlefield. Conclusion. The M4 Sherman tank, a symbol of Allied resilience and engineering prowess during World War II, played a crucial role in numerous pivotal battles across the globe. Its versatility, ease of production, and ability to be upgraded for various combat roles ensured its presence on the front lines from North Africa to the Pacific. Beyond its wartime service, the Sherman continued to influence armored warfare strategies and tank development long after the war. Its legacy, marked by innovation and adaptability, endures as a testament to the collaborative efforts of the Allied nations during one of history's most challenging periods.